why don't we care more about the climate crisis? And why is an adult hiding under the covers? Well, because you can think of this story like a kid who's afraid that there's a monster under the bed. See, the kid hopes that if they just hide long enough, that monster will go away. But in this case, the monster is just getting bigger and more threatening every day.
Unprecedented flood event.
500-year flood.
10 to 20 inches of rain. 4 storm.
Too late to evacuate. 7 million
Fire.
historic storm.
Too late
to evacuate.
That's scary, right? Or do you think that I just edited those clips together to scare you? See, this is the first reason that some of us are a little complacent when it comes to the climate crisis. And I do mean crisis, because even using that word might trigger the assumption of exaggeration. That some people think journalists or scientists or any expert is just firing up the hype machine to get your attention. I mean, take the climate countdown clock in New York. It shows that we only have a few years left to achieve zero carbon emissions before irreversible damage, so hurry. While the clock is precise, the reality is more nuanced. But the underlying truth is very real, and the clock is ticking. I mean, look at these headlines. 2020, the second hottest year on record, with a record-breaking number of Atlantic storms, record-breaking wildfires burning an area larger than the state of Maryland, and globally, 143 million people will be displaced by climate change in the coming years, which is expected to kill more than 250,000 people every year by the end of this decade. But not everyone believes that, partially because of America's political polarization. And if you're someone who has a climate change denier in your life, well, here's some advice on how to talk to them from a psychologist.
If people can agree with something without having to make themselves feel bad or feel stupid, they're more likely to agree with it. So to find some mutual point of agreement, like, I know that you care about your health and your children's health, and I've been reading more and more about how climate change will affect our health. So you're inviting people to kind of build on things they already agree with. And then the other thing I would say is just to tell stories, describe, specific ways in which people might be affected or have been affected, as opposed to giving a kind of hard recitation of cold facts.
Susan Clayton studies and teaches the intersection of climate and psychology at the College of Worcester. And she talked with me about one of the biggest factors contributing to complacency: change blindness. Change blindness is probably best explained by the metaphor of the frog in the pot of boiling water. Now, the story goes that if you had an actual frog and you tossed it in a pot of boiling water, the frog would feel the heat and immediately jump out. Instead, if you put the frog in cool water and gradually raised the heat, supposedly the frog would cook to death. So in the case of climate, the question is, are we that slowly boiling frog?
Absolutely, and I put that in a sort of a slightly broader context, that our brains are not wired to think about this kind of problem. It's very abstract, and it's in the future. And our attention tends to be caught by things that are more immediate and more concrete. Now, I think one thing that's happening is that climate change it's been slow and incremental, but it's not just slow and incremental. There are going to be kind of thresholds and maybe tipping points. And so, people are going to notice those.
And something that amplifies our change blindness is a high noise to signal ratio. Think of it like a bunch of extreme weather events sort of clouding the conversation about the underlying climate change. Because there's a difference in weather and climate. Think of the Camp Fire, which leveled the town of Paradise, California. The wildfire is weather, but climate created the conditions which allowed the fire to burn so intensely, so quickly, killing 85 people. I mean, consider that all of these events happened in just 1 week in 2021 and were either caused or amplified by climate change. A rare wintertime tornado hit Alabama, rain swallowed a California highway, a blizzard buried New York City, and the ocean flooded Boston streets.
We're on Boston's Long Wharf. This area is prone to seeing flooding, but the frequency of those floods, because of rising sea level, is increasing. You can see the water literally pouring in off the harbor. This isn't snow melt. Yes, we had some snow just the other day, but that is the water from the harbor pouring into where people live, where they work, where they dine. And that's the problem with climate change and people's memories. Because back in the 1990s, yes, we had big storms, but sea level was approximately 3 inches lower than it is today. So these minor events wouldn't have happened 3 decades ago.
And the very next day after Chris recorded that, waves demolished 3 homes nearby, further showing how even small changes in sea level impact where we can live. Chris also talked about another climate hurdle in a story for NBC Boston: immediacy.
I want you to meet Dr. Dan Schrag. He's a professor at Harvard and was one of President Obama's go-to climate change experts.
I actually think the reason climate change is such a difficult problem is because it is never the most urgent problem. There's also always something more pressing. The net result of this is that if we keep doing nothing about it, eventually climate change, we may look back and say this was the most important problem that we had to deal with, and we failed to deal with it.
And the last factor in climate complacency is much sunnier. It's also one that I'll admit I'm guilty of sometimes: optimism bias. Here's how a cognitive neuroscientist explains it in a popular TED Talk.
It's a cognitive illusion that we've been studying in my lab for the past few years, and 80% of us have it. It's our tendency to overestimate our likelihood of experiencing good events in our lives and underestimate our likelihood of experiencing bad events.
And a bias toward optimism also helps explain that kid who's hiding under the covers. Remember, the kid thinks if they hide long enough, the monster will go away. They're our little optimist. But the truth with the climate crisis is that we need to get out from under the covers and confront that monster.
If you kind of haul the monster out from under the bed, it may still be scary, but one part of that scariness is gone. You at least gain what we call cognitive control. So if we pull this out and say, hey, this is a major problem, let's deal with it like a rational society might, it becomes less scary.